El Chapo looked more like El Cheapo. While law enforcement authorities rejoiced at his arrest, it's nowhere near mission accomplished in the war against drugs.
For more than 2 decades, the Sinaloa cartel has flooded the U.S. with all kinds of drugs, leaving behind a deadly trail of violence. However, the tides had turned when the U.S. had launched Operation Black Swan, which took out cartel leaders and crippled their operations, changing their fate for the worst. Here are 5 times cartels messed with the wrong country.
Tonight, the crackdown on gangs intensifies in El Salvador.
Ese sufrimiento que le hagan a la población lo van a sufrir ellos aquí.
For decades, Mata Salvatrucha 13, commonly known as MS-13, has been the most ruthless and notorious criminal group in the Western Hemisphere. With operations coming out of El Salvador, they originated from the ghetto immigrant neighborhoods of LA, California in the early 80s, and are mostly known for engaging in drug smuggling, extortion, murder, and prison rackets. In 1979, a civil war had kicked off, nearly tearing apart El Salvador, as leftist guerrillas backed by Cuba and Soviets would fight to overthrow the Salvadoran government, killing over 75,000, and tens of thousands disappeared at the hands of the CIA-trained right-wing death squads. This made more Salvadoran refugees flee north and ended up settling in Southern California, in these Mexican neighborhoods of East and Central LA, as well as San Fernando Valley neighborhoods. And at this time, these areas were under control of Mexican gangs who would exercise their power to harass, brutalize, and extort these new Salvadoran refugees. This made these war-hardened immigrants organize themselves into competing groups, the strongest of which was called the Mata Salvatrucha Stoners, and over time cartels would evolve. They begin to grow and expand their criminal activities, going into the early 90s, with some of their members even arrested and incarcerated. The Mexicans even in prison forced them to bow down to their masters, and this made them fight for dominance from the Mexican Mafia within prison. They became this ultra-violent gang who worked for the latter both on the streets and in jail, and the most dominant Latino gang in American prisons. The cartel added the number 13, thus giving them the name MS-13. The American government and immigration authorities carried out mass deportation of their members to El Salvador and Central American countries, and now these members would escalate their criminal operations in El Salvador, inflicting some unprecedented terror and bloodshed than in any other nation. Now you can spot these members because of their tattoos from head to toe and the different signs they throw at each other. In March 2022, 87 people were brutally murdered within 3 days in El Salvador in retaliation for the government seizure of 2 bus routes in the capital, which MS-13 extorted for revenue. Now this was a challenge for the government because there were innocent people here like fruit sellers, surf instructors, and cobblers being targeted. And to make things worse, corpses and human remains were torn and battered, casted aside like discarded trash on the road leading to Surf City, which is beachfront property on the Pacific coast, which the current Salvadoran president Nayib Bukele has now refurbished and renamed to attract international tourists. The El Salvadoran government had severely tried to crush MS-13 with a series of extraordinary crackdowns, but most fell short of their mark. However, under Bukele's administration, MS-13 is hurting. Bukele had first declared a state of emergency in El Salvador, and then would create numerous new policies, one of which would deprive Salvador's basic constitutional rights, like the right to legal defense and freedom of movement, while simultaneously relaxing rules on making arrests and authorizing the states to intercept civilian communications. They would throw one more policy by mixing up the gang populations in prison, a practice never really implemented to reduce prison violence, but hundreds of bare-chested prisoners were arranged by authorities in their underwear and pressed tightly together in rows, and then pictures were taken, sent as a warning to other gang members. Security forces would launch swift and aggressive assaults on gangs, apprehending members and suspected associates without warrants or even solid evidence, significantly speeding up the process. 33,000 arrests of gang members were made in the first few months of the state of emergency, and then 70,000 gang members were arrested in less than 18 months and thrown in El Salvador's brand new supermax prison known as the Terrorism Confinement Center. Authorities here are permitted to detain individuals indefinitely on vague charges without the necessity necessity of an arrest warrant or even supporting evidence. Detainees are also denied the right to a court hearing within 72 hours of that arrest, and lawyers. Now, these new laws are to keep gang members incarcerated for a long time. Jail sentences have been heightened for gang affiliation, and the option of house arrest for individuals associated with these gangs is no longer an option. Now, it's clear that MS-13's brutal tactics ultimately proved to be a miscalculation, as they inadvertently awakened the fierce determination of the Salvadoran government to end their reign of terror.
Si usted o su gobierno habían recibido presiones de las Fuerzas Armadas para regresar a Cienfuegos.
No admitimos presiones de nadie.
Named after its birthplace in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, the Sinaloa Cartel stands as one of Mexico's oldest and most powerful drug trafficking organizations. The cartel has been a major smuggler of various kinds of drugs from Colombia and Mexico to the U.S., especially in the Asia-Mexico-U.S. triangle, and they're extremely famous for money laundering and murder. The cartel's influence extended beyond Mexico, with operations running in Central and South America, Canada, U.S., primarily the Southwest, Northwest, and East, Anglo-Caribbean, and Australia. The cartel evolved from a small crime syndicate to one of the most powerful organizations in the world. They were founded in the late 60s by Pedro Aviles Perez in Sinaloa. They started off by smuggling marijuana into the U.S. Now, it was Perez, as some of us may know, that innovated the use of aircraft for drug smuggling, which kind of laid the foundation for the large-scale trafficking operations. In the 90s and 2000s, the Sinaloa cartel was under the leadership of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. The duo expands their operations significantly, engaging in brutal wars with rival cartels and even the Mexican government to maintain its power in the drug trade. Now, the cartel continues to operate, usually employing those sophisticated smuggling techniques. Now, El Chapo would be responsible for most of these smuggling corridors. He practically created gangs such as Los Texas, Los Lobos, Los Negros, and Los Chachas, and several more, operating somewhat autonomously within the Sinaloa cartel. With their allies, they were able to assert their dominance, and their rising influence became a key factor in helping them gain international allies, which they used on a higher level. And as a result of their brutal reign of terror, the Sinaloa cartel was responsible for over 1,000 murders in Mexico, with many more in other countries, including the U.S., while their violent clashes with rival gangs added to the toll of untold casualties. In 2007, murders carried out in Sinaloa surged around 400, driven by the cartel's need to assert their dominance following the escape of El Chapo from prison. The violence escalates dramatically over the years. 750 people were killed in 2008, 1,500 in 2009, and a staggering 2,000 butchered in 2010, as the killing continues unchecked. However, a turning point would come back in 2009 with Operation Accelerator, with coordinated effort by U.S. law enforcement that resulted in the arrest of 750 members of the Sinaloa cartel and a seizure of $59 million in cash, along with numerous vehicles, planes, and boats. The Mexican government, under the former Mexican president Enrique Peña Nieto, authorized the capture of El Chapo with the intent to destabilize the Sinaloa cartel. By 2010 and 13, Mexico's security forces had penetrated the cartel's inner circle, leading to the arrests of many top lieutenants, including Mario Nunes, a former member believed to be complicit in at least 350 murders. El Chapo himself became a top target to the U.S. with a $5 million bounty on his head. In 2014, joint efforts of Procuraduría General de la República, Mexican Federal Police, Mexican Navy, and U.S. authorities would lead to the capture of several high-ranking Sinaloa cartel members. The operation marked a significant blow to the cartel's channel of operations, culminating in the arrest of El Chapo, along with his wife and bodyguard, and he was sent to the Altiplano prison in Mexico. But despite being behind bars, he managed to get out of there on July 11, 2015 with his second jailbreak, allowing him to get back to his cartel and resume leadership. However, his freedom was short-lived, because in 2016, Mexican Marines rearrested him, and then they shipped him off to the U.S. for trial. In 2017, he was given life imprisonment plus 30 years and ordered to forfeit $12.6 billion. In 2024, the U.S. continues their relentless effort in the battle against the Sinaloa cartel by apprehending another key leader, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, coupled with Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of Chapo's sons, in El Paso, Texas. Following Following the downfall of these key leaders, the once powerful Sinaloa Empire had been significantly weakened, and now their operations aren't running with the same efficiency and control like they used to.
This was a time when Sicily was ruled by absentee landlords and plagued by banditry. The rural population, struggling to survive, found themselves at the mercy of both the landowners and the bandits who roamed the countryside.
In 1924, Mussolini visited Sicily. He visited a small village near Palermo, where the mayor, Cuccia, was well known.
Sicily, a sun-soaked island with a deep historical background and breathtaking scenery, has long been influenced by the shadow of the Mafia. Now, despite its rich culture and natural beauty, this Mediterranean gem carries a real dark legacy, significantly impacting its history over the centuries. We find traces of the Mafia in 19th century feudal system Sicily, where impoverished people were viciously exploited by local elites, in the absence of any functioning rule of law. With no other means of survival for these poor people, they had no option but to turn to banditry to survive. In return, these elites resorted to hiring other bandits, known as companies at arms, to guard their properties with no police to turn to. Ironically, these mercenaries were often friends or even relatives of the original bandits and worked for many different landowners. Now, over time, these companies at arms would evolve into local protection rackets who kept the bandits at bay while colluding with them to squeeze money and power from the elites. Eventually, they expanded into counterfeiting, kidnapping, ransom, murder, robbery, and witness intimidation. Now, the name Mafia or mafioso roughly can translate to swagger or bravado in Sicilian dialect. The Mafia or Cosa Nostra would come up with their own laws and code of honor, called omerta, which demanded silence in the face of the authorities on pain of death. They would use intimidation to influence elections, entrenching their own power in Sicilian society. By 1922, the rise of fascism under Mussolini brought new challenges to the Mafia's dominance. In 1924, during a high-profile visit to Sicily, he brought a retinue of soldiers, submarines, battleships, and his own police force, which was the bare minimum for any self-respecting dictator. However, Don Francesco Cuccia, a prominent Mafia figure and then mayor, regarded it as a grave insult and supposedly told Mussolini that he doesn't need all these cops because he's under his protection. Mussolini didn't take that too well and refused him his hospitality, and as a result, Cuccia retaliated by refusing Mussolini his audience. When Mussolini emerged onto the balcony overlooking the central square, resplendent in full regalia, he wasn't met with the thunderous applause he anticipated. Instead, he was met with a lukewarm reception of village idiots, beggars, and homeless people who had been deliberately assembled by Cuccia to humiliate him. Now, the experience proved mortifying for Mussolini. This defiance would openly challenge Mussolini's authority in Sicily, which in turn eroded his grip on power. In 1925, Mussolini authorized Cesare Mori, who was a veteran lawman with 5 years of experience battling Mafia, to spearhead a campaign aimed at destroying the Mafia and asserting fascist control over Sicilian life. Up to that point, Mori had only been successful in capturing the Mafia's low-level bandits, as the real mafioso dons had connections that protected them from prosecution. However, with Mussolini's backing, Mori waged a vigorous war against the Cosa Nostra, raiding prefectures, police stations, ministries, and even mansions, in a bid to dismantle the organized crime syndicate. By 1926, as the battle was ensuing, he had laid siege to the hilltop town of Ganji by surrounding it with lorries and armored cars, even cutting off telephone lines. Mori's men combed through the neighborhood, searching house by house to flush and arrest mafiosos. They would stage a public spectacle in the town square, slaughtering livestock and detaining the families of Mafia members, including their wives and children, as leverage against the syndicate. The town crier also marched through the streets proclaiming a public ultimatum. Mafia members were then ordered to surrender themselves immediately. Mori's relentless campaign against the Mafia was nothing short of ruthless. In one town alone, he would capture 130 members and 300 of their associates. His crackdown spread across Sicily, where 3 more operations led to 150 additional arrests. Overall, this guy had captured 11,000 individuals. It was a major blow to the Mafia, significantly weakening their grip on the region and marking a crucial victory in the battle to dismantle their criminal network.
And they found Trevino Morales $2 million in cash, 8 heavy weapons, and 2 other men.
Nick, this is a guy who used to put his enemies in drums and pour gasoline on them and set them on fire.
If we're talking about some of the most dangerous and deadliest Mexican drug cartels, we can't leave out Los Zetas. In 1997, the cartel began with Ociel Cárdenas Guillen's rise to power as the leader of the Gulf Cartel. However, his newfound position came with a dangerous price: a violent turf war on a quest to safeguard his organization and maintain control in the face of their enemies. He would get help from Arturo Guzman de Sena, a retired army lieutenant in the Mexican army, who became the first commander of another separate group in the Gulf Cartel. De Sena managed to recruit over 30 deserters from the elite Grupo Arov de Faz Especial, who were enticed by the promise of higher salaries than what they were being paid in the military. And some of these former members would get trained in commando and urban warfare from both Israel and U.S. Special Forces. De Sena's group came to be known as Zetas, a name derived from the Spanish word for the letter Z. He chose this name as part of his effort to strengthen his ranks and build a powerful identity for the organization. The group began engaging in various criminal activities like kidnapping, protecting rackets, extortion, supply and trafficking drugs, and eliminating any of their enemies in the most brutal way possible. They would assert more of an active leadership role within the Gulf Cartel, and their influence would grow significantly. At this time, Los Zetas was made of members of various backgrounds, including corrupt federal, state, and local police officers, former U.S. Army personnel, and the special forces of the Guatemalan Army. This marked Los Zetas as a paramilitary criminal organization, and over time, they became notorious for their brutality, using shock and awe tactics like beheading, and indiscriminate murder. Now, their military operations consist of occupying territories by taking control through sheer force and then exploiting the criminal underworld within. But their military training would be diluted over time. They were also known for their special Los Zetas commando medallions as symbols of their dedication to this organization, which shows great significance within their ranks. As Los Zetas would grow in rapid power, surpassing the Gulf Cartel even in terms of revenue, membership, and influence in Mexico, the latter attempted to curtail the former's expanding influence, but it backfired and resulted in a brutal war. Ultimately, Los Zetas separated themselves from the Gulf Cartel. The independence of Los Zetas enabled them to broaden their criminal enterprise, penetrating human and drug trafficking on a global scale. These operations affected nations from Colombia to the U.S. and even extended as far as Asia, cementing their position as a transnational criminal organization. In a bid to assert dominance, Los Zetas is responsible for numerous massacres and attacks, targeting not only rival cartels but also innocent citizens. On August 24, 2010, migrants seeking a better life were brutally murdered in San Fernando. That same year, the cartel would blow up an oil facility in Puebla, which claimed the lives of 28 people, injuring 52 more, as well as damaging 115 homes. Between April and June 2011, one bloody massacre was in San Fernando with 193 people dying, and in Guatemala, 27 farmers were mercilessly killed by Los Zetas on May 15, 2011. Still in that same year, they invaded the town of Allende, Coahuila, near the Texas border, and unleashed unspeakable horror, where about an estimated 300 to 500 innocent civilians were gruesomely killed and burned. This was done as an act of revenge against 2 informants, their families, and anyone remotely connected to them. The prisons were not exempted from the horrifying acts, as 31 inmates from the Gulf Cartel were killed by Los Zetas in a prison brawl on January 4, 2012. At this point, the U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies had had enough as they embark on a series of aggressive campaigns, disrupting operations and dismantling infrastructure, one of which enabled the ATF, DEA, ICE, and the FBI to carry out a joint operation, which led to the identification and raid of 3 Los Zetas safe houses in Mexico. It was also one of the largest weapon seizures ever recorded in Mexico's history. In 2012, Obama had imposed sanctions on Los Zetas and offered a substantial $5 million reward for any information leading to the capture of Miguel Trevino Morales, known as Z40, one of Los Zetas' leaders. The Mexican government gave 30 million pesos for his brother, Omar Trevino Morales, aka Z42. Miguel and Omar, with their other brother, were eventually apprehended and indicted on charges in Texas. Several high-ranking leaders and lieutenants began falling after these 3 were arrested. Now, this This crackdown disrupted the cartel's command structure, sending a strong warning to other members and potential recruits. In the aftermath, Miguel Treviño Morales was extradited to the U.S., further hampering the cartel's operations and diminishing their influence. There's a cartel combining tactics of religion and brutality, operating out of the state of Michoacán. We introduce you to La Familia Michoacana.
Pero hay un retén por un grupo. En esta dirección pasamos por una terracería, hay 3 retenes, otro grupo criminal por ahí.
Founded in the 1980s by Carlos Rosales Mendoza, a close associate of Ociel Cárdenas, and Nazario Morena Gonzalez, known as El Más Loco, which translated to the craziest one. Now, the cartel started off by protecting the poor, countering interloping kidnappers and drug dealers, and to bring order to the Mexican state of Michoacán. In the 90s, La Familia allied with the Gulf Cartel as part of this paramilitary group to seize control of illegal drug trading in Michoacana from these rival drug cartels. Although it initially trained with Los Zetas, they would separate into this independent drug trafficking operation in 2006. With this newfound independence, they set out to dominate. Now, what sets La Familia apart from other cartels was this unique blend of criminality and bizarre religious ideology. La Familia's leaders, Moreno Gonzalez and Mendez Vargas, regarded their assassinations and things as acts of divine justice. It's pretty crazy. In a turn of events, Gonzalez even published his own Bible, based off of Christian author John Eldridge, using his own understanding of what John said, that every man must have a battle to fight, a beauty to rescue, and an adventure to live. He would call this book Salvaje de Corazón, Wild at Heart, a must-read not only for La Familia gang members, but also local teachers and National Development Education, CONAFE, to circulate Eldridge's writings throughout the Michoacán countryside. This was basically a code of conduct for all the members of La Familia, with stipulations like no permission for members to take drugs or alcohol, and no harming of women and children. Now, if you want to get promoted in this cartel, it's not just about target practice, but also regular attendance at prayer meetings. So, in line with this benevolent and religious image, the cartel has made a lot of charitable donations to local schools, churches, farmers, businesses, as well as paying for new infrastructure in deprived areas. The people of Michoacán were looking at their protectors like they were the Messiah, but it would also extend its operations beyond Michoacán in Mexico to various states across the U.S. In 2009 and 10, La Familia Michoacana offered to disband their cartel with the condition that both the federal government and state and federal police commit to safeguarding the security of the state of Michoacán. But Felipe Calderón rejected their calls for dialogue. After the killing of its founder and leader, Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, in 2010, several leaders split off to form the Knights Templar. On July 11, 2009, La Familia members attacked the federal police station in Morelia, Michoacana, in this attempt to free cartel lieutenant Arnoldo Rueda Medina shortly after his arrest. During these attacks, 2 soldiers and 3 federal policemen were killed. After they aborted that mission, the cartel started attacking federal police installations in at least a half a dozen Michoacán cities in retribution. 3 days later, the cartel would torture and murder 12 Mexican federal police agents who were investigating crime in Michoacán and dump their bodies along the side of a mountain highway, along with this inscription, "So that you come for another, we'll be waiting for you here." In response to these brutal acts, President Calderón dispatched an additional 1,000 federal officers to this area. The Mexican government would offer $2 million each for information that could lead to the capture of El Más Loco and his 3 associates, Jose de Jesus Mendez Vargas, Servando Gómez Martinez, and Enrique Blancarte Solís. The Mexican law enforcement agencies had collaborated with the U.S. in arresting key players of La Familia in this attempt to deplete cartel-induced violence in Michoacán. On July 21, 2009, 4 suspected La Familia members were arrested in connection to the murder of those 12 police officers in Michoacana. One of these detained men, Jose Alberto López Barón, or El Gordo, answered directly to Servando Gómez Martinez, La Tuta, who controlled the operations for La Familia Michoacana in Arteaga and Lázaro Cárdenas, Michoacán. On July 29 the same year, Armando Quintero Guerra, who was the manager of finances for La Tuta, was also arrested. In early August of that same year, federal police stormed a Sunday Mass in the town of Apatzingan and arrested Miguel Ángel Beraza, or La Troca, who was responsible for moving a half a ton of crystal meth into the U.S. each month. In 2010, El Mas Loco was allegedly killed by Mexican police, but it was discovered that he wasn't dead at that time. Eventually, he was killed in 2014 during a shootout. Medina was extradited to the U.S. and given 45 years in prison in 2017 and 18, respectively, thereby crippling the operations of La Familia.